Be sure you have the handout that's labeled Change in Demand handy as you listen to this recording. First of all, let's review the difference between what we mean by a change in quantity demanded versus a change in demand. If we have a change in quantity demanded, this is a situation where the only thing that's changing about a particular good is its price, and therefore when the price changes, you have movement on the same demand curve. However, when there are factors other than price that are changing about a particular good, then you can have what we call a change in demand, which means the demand curve will actually shift. In other words, it will shift to the right, or meaning that demand has increased, or it will shift to the left, meaning that demand has decreased. So let's take an example. Let's refer to that handout that's labeled Change in Demand. All right, and if you notice there on that handout at the top, we have the example of steak. And the first question on that handout says, all right, is steak a normal good or an inferior good? All right, well, for most people, steak is a good that they like to eat. So therefore, we will refer to steak as being a normal good. In other words, as someone's income increases, they would typically like to eat more steak, and in turn, if their income decreases, they would eat less steak because it's a good they can't afford as much of, and they would substitute other goods in place of the steak. So typically we would say that for most people, steak would be a normal good. All right, and let's go beyond that, and let's think about some things that could cause a change in demand for steak. And again, when we're talking about change in demand, we're talking about a shifting of the demand curve. All right, now one factor would be a change in income. All right, and since steak is a normal good, all right, as someone's income rises, typically demand for steak would increase. All right, and as income falls, we would find that demand for steak would decrease. All right, now some other factors that could cause a change in demand for steak. If we think about the prices of related substitutes and complements. Now again, note here, this is an important point. Okay, we're not looking at the price of steak, we're looking at the price of related substitutes and complements. All right, so for many people, chicken would be a reasonable substitute for steak. So if the price of chicken would rise, people would be inclined to buy more steak, so therefore demand for steak would increase. And we would have that shifting of the demand curve. All right, and when the price of chicken falls, if people think that's an acceptable substitute for steak, people would tend to consume more chicken, and therefore demand for steak would decrease. And again, we would have that shifting, that decrease in the demand curve. All right, now let's think about some things that would go along with, or would be complements with steak. An example of a complement with steak would be a potato. All right, and since people tend to consume them together, if the price of potatoes rises, all right, we would tend to see demand for steak to fall. In other words, if they're consumed together and the complement is getting more expensive, we would tend to see people buy less steak, and therefore demand would decrease, and we would get that shifting of the demand curve. All right, but when the price of potatoes falls, in other words, that complementary good is becoming less expensive and people consume them together, we would tend to find demand for steak would increase, and again, we would have that shifting of the demand curve. All right, and notice here when we're talking about substitutes and complements. All right, with the substitute chicken, notice when the price of chicken was rising, demand for steak was rising. All right, and notice when the price of chicken was falling, demand for steak was falling. All right, and then notice for potato, which is the complementary good, all right, when the price of potatoes was rising, demand for steak was falling. All right, and when the price of potatoes was falling, demand for steak was rising. So notice how the relationships are exactly opposite when we're talking about what happens with steak when we're using a substitute good like chicken and when we're using a complementary good like potato. In other words, notice how those relationships in terms of what happens to demand for steak are exactly opposite when we're using a substitute versus when we're using a complement. All right, and then let's move on to changing expectations and how could this affect the demand for steak. Well, let's say, for instance, that people hear that, well, eating more steak is not good for you because steak has too high a fat content, so it would be a good idea for health concerns and health reasons to limit the consumption of steak. Well, that might cause demand for steak to decrease. But let's say conversely that a news story comes out that mentions that steak would be a really good source of iron as a form of red meat, and therefore it would be a good idea to consume steak on a somewhat regular basis. So therefore, people, if they read that, that might cause them to think, well, see, steak is good for me, I should eat more of it, and could cause the demand for steak to increase. All right, and market size is another factor. Certainly, if you just have more consumers, it's likely that they're going to eat more steak, and therefore, if you have a smaller market, in turn, less consumers, so that would tend to decrease the demand for steak. All right, now moving from our example of steak, all right, let's move to our next example with peanut butter. All right, and first question there is whether peanut butter is a normal good or an inferior good. And peanut butter is actually an inferior good, meaning that as people's income increases, they tend to eat less peanut butter. And as people's income decreases, they tend to eat more peanut butter. And it will be more clear in terms of why peanut butter is an inferior good when we get to the material in chapter 19 of the textbook, which is about elasticity. In other words, a type of elasticity that we refer to as income elasticity really tells the whole story. In other words, explains why peanut butter is an inferior good. So when we get there, it'll become even a little bit more clear why peanut butter would be considered to be an inferior good. All right, and now we're going to think about some factors that could cause a change in demand for peanut butter. All right, and one of those factors is a change in income. All right, and we find as income goes up, that demand for peanut butter would tend to go down. In other words, if people have more money, they would rather consume something else other than peanut butter, so demand would tend to decrease. All right, and as income falls, since peanut butter is an inferior good, all right, people tend to consume more of it and less of goods that would typically be more expensive. All right, and then moving to prices of related substitutes and complements. All right, a substitute for peanut butter, for some people, they would consider Nutella to be a reasonable substitute. Perhaps you've seen those ads on TV that people put that on toast for breakfast in the morning. All right, and we would find that when the price of Nutella rises, that people would tend to buy less Nutella, but in turn, demand for peanut butter would tend to increase. All right, and when the price of Nutella falls, all right, people would tend to buy more Nutella, and in turn, they would tend to buy less peanut butter, so therefore demand for peanut butter would decrease. All right, and then if you think of complementary goods for peanut butter, an example of a complementary good would be jelly. And we find that when the price of jelly rises, we would tend to see demand for peanut butter would go down because people tend to consume them together. So if one of the goods is becoming more expensive, jelly, then people would tend in turn to demand or buy less peanut butter. All right, and when the price of jelly falls, we would tend to find demand for peanut butter would rise because, again, people consume them together. So when one of the complementary goods, in this case jelly, becomes less costly, people would tend to demand more peanut butter. So if you notice here again, notice those relationships with substitutes and complements. All right, and notice how they're exactly different when we're talking about prices rising and falling. Okay, they're going in opposite directions. And changing expectations, how could this affect the demand for peanut butter? Well, if, for instance, people heard that eating more peanut butter would be good because it has the peanuts have vitamin A in them, and therefore that would be a good source of vitamin A. People would tend to consume more peanut butter. But likewise, let's say there was a news story that said, well, peanut butter has a higher fat content associated with it, and therefore it might not be good in terms of heart health, and that might in turn discourage people from eating as much peanut butter, and therefore demand for peanut butter could decrease. And market size, all right, and similar fashion to what we saw for steak. If you have a larger group of consumers, therefore they could buy more peanut butter because there are more of them. And likewise, if there is a smaller group of consumers, then in turn that might decrease the demand for peanut butter simply because we have a smaller market size. All right, and now let's focus on change in supply. All right, and we're using an example of an orange in this case. All right, so we're thinking now from the supplier's perspective. All right, now remember that before we investigate factors that could cause a change in supply, let's mention first the difference between when we say we have a change in quantity supplied versus a change in supply. All right, if we have a change in quantity supplied, all right, the only thing that's changing about the good is the price, and we have movement on the same supply curve. But if there's something about a good other than price, in other words, there's something about the orange in this case, something that's changing other than the price of oranges. All right, that could cause a change in supply, in other words, cause the supply curve to shift. And supply curve could shift whereby supply could increase, or supply curve could shift whereby supply could decrease. All right, so let's think about some of the factors that could cause a change in supply. All right, one of those factors would be the cost of inputs used to produce the product. Let's say, for instance, that certain kinds of fertilizers and chemicals, let's say they become more expensive in producing oranges. Well, if it's becoming more expensive to be able to produce the product from the supplier's perspective, that might cause a decrease in supply. And in turn, if those costs associated with producing those oranges, those factors become less costly, the price of those goes down, then that in turn may cause supply for oranges to increase. All right, and the next item is technology and productivity. Now, typically when we think about changes like these, we're thinking about something that would make it better, easier, perhaps less costly to be able to produce oranges. So in most instances, factors such as those would cause an increase in supply. All right, and the next item is taxes and subsidies. All right, now taxes could go up or down. All right, but if the taxes associated with the production that are imposed on the growers, if taxes increase, then that would typically cause supply to decrease. But in turn, if taxes go down, taxes decrease, then that would tend to cause supply to increase. And with subsidies, all right, this is a payment from the government to a farmer to assist them with their costs associated with growing their product. So therefore, if subsidies are being offered, we would typically find in those cases that supply would increase. All right, price expectations. All right, if a farmer thought that prices for oranges were going to go up in the short term, they may be inclined to supply more oranges because they figure they could get a higher price for them. But if they expect that the prices for oranges would tend to decrease in the short term, they may be inclined to produce less of them, thereby making less profit. In other words, it's all about the profit potential, so if they expect the prices for those oranges to go down in the future, it may actually discourage them and cause them to supply less. And the number of firms in the industry is also a factor when we're talking about supply. The more firms there are producing oranges, the greater supply will cause supply to increase, and the lesser number of firms there are that are producing those oranges, you would tend to see a decrease in supply.